The moment the morning headlines broke that a federal judge had slapped a dramatic legal stay on the Trump administration's attempt to strip temporary protected status, TPS, from some 350,000 Haitian immigrants just hours before those protections were set to lapse, was not just legal news, it was a moment of cinematic irony. This wasn't a dry courtroom procedure. This was a blunt rebuke delivered with a seriousness that echoed far beyond immigration policy. A blistering ruling that made clear not only that Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem had likely overstepped her authority, but that her own words and coarse rhetoric had collided head-on with constitutional limits, exposing a fault line that would reverberate through politics, courts, and communities across the country. As the gavel fell in a Washington, D.C. courtroom where Judge Anna Reyes, a Biden-appointed jurist, issued a stay blocking the termination of Haitian TPS, the ruling didn't just preserve legal status and work authorization for hundreds of thousands of people. It painstakingly outlined how Noem's decision was likely arbitrary and capricious, failing to follow required procedures and appearing to be influenced, at least in part, by hostility toward non-white immigrants, a characterization grounded not merely in legal interpretation, but tied directly to the inflammatory language the secretary had used publicly about Haitian refugees weeks earlier. In an era where every tweet, every headline, and every soundbite can be dissected in real time, Noem's own coarse online commentary, the kind of unfiltered adversarial rhetoric that once seemed like political theater, suddenly became a substantive part of a judicial critique, a moment where the instinct to lob visceral attacks and shortcuts collided with the sobering reality of constitutional law and procedural fairness. The ruling paused not only the government's plan to end TPS, but also the lived fear in immigrant communities that their hard-won legal protections might be stripped away without adequate fact-finding or regard for human cost, a fear now replaced with temporary relief, but also with deep uncertainty about what comes next. But for Haitian TPS holders, a group composed of professionals, families, students, and workers who had established lives in the United States under humanitarian designation after devastating earthquakes and ongoing turmoil in Haiti, the judge's words hit home. These were not abstractions, but real people whose continued presence was at stake, whose fate was tethered to a legal process suddenly drenched in political and cultural symbolism. The courtroom drama unfolded against a broader backdrop of heated appeals, court decisions that had already found Noem's attempt to end TPS for Venezuelans and Haitians unlawful because she exceeded her authority and bypassed statutory safeguards, reinforcing the narrative that administrative power, even when backed by political fervor, has limits that judges are still willing to enforce. What made this moment so gripping beyond the legal technicalities was the interplay between words and consequences. A secretary's coarse dismissal of vulnerable populations on social media was now being scrutinized months later as evidence that influenced judicial assessment of her motives, raising urgent questions about how political instincts, unfiltered rhetoric, and policy can come undone in the crucible of constitutional review. And as television hosts, anchors, and commentators scrambled to interpret the ruling for millions of Americans, some framing it as a victory for human rights and due process, others decrying it as judicial overreach, the larger story had already transcended immigration policy alone, becoming a saga about accountability, the limits of executive power, and how a single moment of unguarded expression can echo and boomerang with consequences far larger than its author ever anticipated. As the ruling rippled outward from the courthouse steps, what quickly became clear was that this wasn't just a technical immigration decision buried in legal language, but a sharp collision between political instinct and judicial restraint, one where Secretary Kristi Noem's approach to leadership, blunt, confrontational, and unapologetically combative, was now being examined not as rhetoric for a rally or a tweet meant to energize supporters, but as a potential indicator of bias that influenced policy decisions affecting hundreds of thousands of lives. Legal analysts pored over Judge Reyes's opinion, noting how carefully it dissected the administrative process behind the TPS termination, highlighting missing evidence, rushed timelines, and the striking absence of updated country condition reports that would normally be required before stripping humanitarian protections, especially for a nation like Haiti, still grappling with political instability, gang violence, and humanitarian crises. The judge's language was unusually direct, signaling frustration with what she described as a decision that appeared driven more by political posture than by law, a sentiment that resonated with civil rights groups who had warned for weeks that Noem's public comments revealed a predisposition that undermined the neutrality required of a federal official. Behind closed doors at the Department of Homeland Security, officials reportedly scrambled to assess the fallout, realizing that the ruling didn't just pause one policy, but cast doubt on the broader strategy of rapidly dismantling TPS programs for multiple countries, a strategy that had been central to the administration's immigration hardline agenda. Staff attorneys reviewed the court's criticism line by line, aware that similar legal vulnerabilities could surface in other cases already moving through the federal system. Meanwhile, immigrant advocacy organizations seized the moment, holding emergency press conferences where Haitian families spoke emotionally about the fear of deportation that had hung over them for months, recounting sleepless nights, children asking whether they would have to leave the only home they had ever known, and workers unsure whether they should keep showing up to jobs that now felt temporary. The political reaction was immediate and fierce, with Democrats praising the judge for standing up to what they called an unlawful and reckless attempt to erase humanitarian protections, while Republicans accused the courts of blocking executive authority and interfering with immigration enforcement. Cable news panels erupted into familiar ideological showdowns, but beneath the noise was a deeper tension. Could an official's public language really influence how courts evaluate administrative decisions? And if so, what did that mean for an era where political leaders communicate impulsively and publicly, often without filters or legal caution? Constitutional scholars weighed in, explaining that while policy can't be overturned solely because of harsh rhetoric, such statements can be relevant when assessing whether a decision was made in good faith or was improperly motivated. A nuance that made Noem's coarse tweet far more consequential than a moment of online outrage. Social media, as expected, amplified every angle of the controversy, with clips of Noem's past comments circulating alongside excerpts from the ruling, creating a dramatic narrative arc where words spoken casually weeks earlier now appeared to boomerang with legal force. Supporters defended her as a straight-talking leader, unafraid to confront illegal immigration, while critics argued her rhetoric exposed an underlying hostility toward vulnerable populations that should disqualify such sweeping policy decisions. Hashtags trended, memes spread, and simplified versions of the ruling went viral, often stripping away legal nuance in favor of emotional punch. A modern courtroom drama unfolding in real time on millions of screens. What added another layer of intensity was the broader historical context of TPS itself, a program created by Congress to provide temporary refuge to people from countries facing extraordinary conditions like natural disasters and armed conflict. A safety net that had allowed Haitian immigrants to legally live and work in the U.S. for years, building communities and contributing to the economy. Economists pointed out that ending TPS abruptly would have disrupted industries ranging from healthcare to construction, sectors heavily reliant on immigrant labor, while local officials warned of ripple effects in cities with large Haitian populations. This wasn't just about immigration law. It was about families, businesses, and the fabric of entire neighborhoods that now hung in the balance. Inside the courtroom, observers described the judge's demeanor as firm but measured, a reminder that while political debates often thrive on emotion and spectacle, the legal system ultimately hinges on procedure, evidence, and adherence to statutory authority. Her decision made clear that regardless of political goals, agencies must follow the law, conduct proper reviews, and justify changes with factual findings, a principle that many legal experts said would likely shape future challenges to immigration rollbacks. The ruling also served as a warning shot to other officials. Public rhetoric, especially when inflammatory, could come back to haunt administrative actions when scrutinized by courts. As evening fell and news alerts continued to buzz across phones nationwide, the narrative had evolved from a simple policy block into a cautionary tale about governance in the digital age, where a single tweet could echo through legal chambers months later, shaping perceptions of motive and fairness. For Noem, the moment was a stark reminder that political bravado might energize a base, but could also undermine credibility in courtrooms where restraint and neutrality are paramount. For Haitian TPS holders, it was a temporary reprieve, a breath of relief tinged with anxiety about what battles still lay ahead. And as the nation digested the day's developments, one truth settled in. This wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of a larger reckoning over immigration authority, executive power, and how modern political communication intersects with the rule of law, setting the stage for even more intense legal showdowns and political maneuvering in the chapters to come. As lawyers on both sides prepared for the next legal phase, the case began to reveal something deeper than a simple immigration dispute, exposing how power struggles inside Washington often unfold quietly long before they explode into public view. Because behind Noem's highly visible rhetoric, there had been weeks of internal tension within the Department of Homeland Security, where career officials reportedly raised concerns about the rushed timeline and warned that abruptly ending TPS for Haitians without updated humanitarian assessments could almost certainly fail in court, advice that some insiders said was brushed aside in the push to deliver a political win that aligned with the administration's hardline promises on immigration. According to people familiar with the process, policy drafts were fast-tracked, reviews were shortened, and long-standing procedural safeguards were treated as obstacles rather than necessities, creating a legal vulnerability that Judge Reyes would later seize upon in her ruling, a vulnerability made even more glaring when paired with Noem's public comments that appeared to frame Haitian migrants as burdens rather than beneficiaries of humanitarian protection. The appeals process quickly became the next battleground, with government attorneys signaling their intention to challenge the stay and argue that the executive branch has broad authority over immigration classifications, a claim that has historically held weight but has increasingly faced resistance when courts find that agencies bypass required rulemaking procedures. Legal scholars noted that while presidents do have discretion over TPS designations, that discretion is not limitless and abrupt reversals must still be grounded in factual findings and lawful processes, a point that has tripped up multiple administrations across party lines. In this case, however, the added layer of inflammatory rhetoric gave plaintiffs an extra argument that the decision may have been influenced by improper considerations rather than neutral assessment of conditions in Haiti. Across the country, Haitian community leaders mobilized quickly, organizing rallies, prayer vigils, and legal aid clinics to help families understand what the ruling meant and what uncertainties still remained. In Miami, New York, Boston, and parts of Florida, crowds gathered outside courthouses and government buildings holding signs calling for dignity and stability, many sharing personal stories of fleeing violence, rebuilding their lives in the U.S., and now facing the emotional whiplash of potentially losing everything. Local news crews captured parents explaining how their children were U.S. citizens who had never set foot in Haiti, underscoring the human stakes often overshadowed by political rhetoric. At the same time, conservative media outlets framed the ruling as another example of what they described as activist judges obstructing border security, arguing that TPS had become a de facto permanent program rather than a temporary humanitarian measure. Commentators questioned whether continuing protections for Haitians incentivized illegal immigration, even though TPS applies only to individuals already in the U.S. during designated periods. This narrative clashed sharply with human rights organizations who emphasized Haiti's ongoing crises, including political instability, economic collapse, and rampant gang violence, conditions they argued made large-scale returns dangerous and irresponsible. Inside Congress, the case reignited long-standing debates over immigration reform and the future of TPS itself, with some lawmakers pushing for permanent residency pathways for long-term TPS holders who had lived in the U.S. for decades, while others insisted on stricter enforcement and clearer expiration timelines. The ruling added urgency to these conversations as it demonstrated how fragile TPS protections could be when subject to shifting political priorities. Legislative proposals resurfaced that had stalled for years, and hearings were scheduled where DHS officials were expected to testify about the decision-making process behind the attempted termination. What struck many observers was how closely the entire episode mirrored past immigration battles where political pressure to appear tough on migration often collided with legal realities and humanitarian considerations. From travel bans to asylum restrictions, courts had repeatedly stepped in to block or reshape policies that were implemented too quickly or without sufficient legal grounding. Noem's TPS rollback now joined that growing list, reinforcing a pattern where aggressive executive action triggered equally forceful judicial pushback. As the story continued to evolve, analysts began to speculate about the broader political consequences for Noem herself, a prominent figure often discussed as a future national leader within conservative circles. Some suggested the ruling could dent her reputation as a decisive administrator, painting her instead as someone whose impulsive rhetoric and rushed policy decisions invited legal defeat. Others argued her base would view the clash with the courts as proof she was fighting the establishment, potentially boosting her standing among hardline voters. Either way, the moment had elevated her from a policy official to a central character in a national legal drama. law.
By the end of this phase, it was clear that the case was no longer just about Haitian TPS protections, but about the balance of power between executive ambition and judicial oversight, the role of language in shaping legal outcomes, and the human consequences that unfold when political instincts override careful governance. The courtroom had become a stage where broader questions about democracy, accountability, and compassion were playing out in real time, and the outcome would likely influence immigration battles for years to come.
As the legal battle intensified, attention began shifting from the courtroom to the carefully choreographed world of political messaging, where both sides worked relentlessly to shape public perception of the ruling, revealing just how much modern governance depends not only on policy outcomes but on narrative control. Within hours of the judge's decision, press teams released sharply worded statements designed to frame the moment either as a triumph of justice or a dangerous setback for national security, with Noem's allies emphasizing her commitment to enforcing immigration laws while downplaying the court's criticism of process and motive, and immigrant advocates highlighting the judge's language about arbitrary decision-making and humanitarian concerns as evidence that the administration had acted recklessly. Television networks ran looping footage of the courthouse steps while pundits debated whether Noem's rhetoric had crossed a line from political speech into legal liability, transforming what began as a policy dispute into a broader cultural conversation about leadership in the age of instant communication. Behind closed doors, political strategists reportedly advised Noem to soften her public tone, recognizing that further inflammatory comments could be cited in future court proceedings, a suggestion that underscored the growing awareness within government that every public statement now exists as a permanent record capable of resurfacing at critical moments. Yet the tension between appealing to a political base and navigating legal realities remained palpable, with insiders describing heated discussions about whether to double down on tough rhetoric or pivot toward a more measured, law-focused approach. This internal struggle reflected a broader challenge facing modern politicians who often rise to prominence through bold, provocative language, but later find that same language scrutinized under legal microscopes. Meanwhile, advocacy organizations launched coordinated campaigns to humanize the impact of TPS protections, producing video testimonials, social media stories, and public events that showcased Haitian families whose lives had been stabilized by the program, aiming to counter political narratives that framed TPS recipients as abstract policy issues rather than real people with deep roots in American communities. These efforts resonated widely, with some stories going viral and drawing millions of views, reminding the public that behind every court ruling were individuals whose futures hung in the balance. Teachers spoke about students terrified of losing their parents. Business owners described employees who had worked with them for decades, and community leaders emphasized the cultural and economic contributions Haitians had made across the country. The media landscape itself became part of the story, as different outlets emphasized dramatically different aspects of the ruling depending on their audiences, with some focusing on judicial limits to executive power and others framing the decision as an obstacle to immigration enforcement. This polarization reinforced existing divisions, but it also highlighted how complex legal developments can be reduced into competing sound bites that often obscure nuance. Legal analysts repeatedly attempted to clarify that the ruling did not permanently grant TPS, but merely blocked its abrupt termination until proper procedures were followed, a distinction frequently lost amid more sensational headlines. International observers also weighed in, particularly in Haiti, where the potential mass return of TPS holders had raised alarms among humanitarian groups already overwhelmed by ongoing crises. Officials and aid organizations warned that Haiti lacked the infrastructure to absorb hundreds of thousands of returning residents, predicting worsening instability if protections were lifted suddenly. These concerns added global stakes to what had initially appeared as a domestic legal issue, reinforcing arguments that immigration policy decisions reverberate far beyond U.S. borders. Within academic circles, the case quickly became a teaching moment, with law professors dissecting the ruling in classrooms and online forums to illustrate principles of administrative law, executive authority, and the importance of procedural compliance. Students analyzed how public statements by officials could influence judicial assessments of motive, marking a shift in how legal accountability intersects with modern communication. Many scholars noted that this case could set important precedents for how courts evaluate the role of rhetoric in policymaking, potentially shaping future challenges across a range of government actions. As weeks passed and uncertainty lingered, Haitian TPS holders lived in a state of cautious relief, grateful for the temporary protection, yet aware that appeals and future rulings could still alter their fate. The emotional toll was evident, with community counselors reporting increased anxiety and stress among families who felt caught in a political tug-of-war beyond their control. Despite the pause granted by the court, the looming question of permanence remained unanswered, fueling ongoing activism and legal efforts to secure long-term solutions. By the end of this chapter of the story, it was clear that Noem's coarse tweet and the subsequent ruling had sparked far more than a single policy setback. They had ignited a broader reckoning over the consequences of political rhetoric, the responsibilities of public office, and the fragile line between bold leadership and unlawful action. The clash had exposed how quickly words could transform into legal liabilities, how human lives could become entangled in political strategies, and how the courts continued to serve as a powerful check when executive ambition raced ahead of legal boundaries, setting the stage for an even more consequential resolution still to come. As the appeals process slowly moved forward, the ruling began to ripple outward in ways few had initially anticipated, influencing not just the fate of Haitian TPS holders, but the broader landscape of immigration policy across the United States, with advocacy groups filing new lawsuits that cited Judge Reyes's language as precedent to challenge other abrupt TPS terminations and administrative rollbacks. Lawyers representing Venezuelan, Salvadoran, and Honduran TPS communities pointed to the court's emphasis on procedural fairness and improper motive, arguing that similar shortcuts and political pressures had shaped decisions affecting their clients as well, effectively turning Noem's setback into a strategic blueprint for nationwide legal resistance. Federal courts in other jurisdictions began referencing the ruling, signaling that the judiciary might be entering a new phase of heightened scrutiny over executive actions that bypass established rulemaking norms. Within the Trump administration, officials reportedly reassessed their immigration strategy, recognizing that rapid policy reversals without extensive documentation and humanitarian assessments were increasingly vulnerable to legal defeat. Some insiders described a shift toward slower, more methodical approaches designed to withstand court challenges, while others pushed for aggressive appeals, viewing judicial resistance as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a warning to adapt. This internal divide reflected the broader tension between ideological goals and practical governance, where the desire for swift political victories clashed with the realities of administrative law. A pressure mounted on Congress as well, as lawmakers faced growing calls to create permanent protections for long-term TPS holders who had lived and worked in the U.S. for decades. Bipartisan bills resurfaced proposing pathways to legal residency, supported by business groups, faith organizations, and local governments that depended on TPS recipients as integral members of their communities. Yet political gridlock remained a formidable barrier, with immigration reform once again caught between competing priorities and partisan disputes. Still, the emotional stories amplified by the court ruling injected renewed urgency into the debate, making it harder for lawmakers to ignore the human impact of inaction. Public opinion surveys conducted in the weeks following the ruling revealed a complex and shifting landscape, with many Americans expressing sympathy for TPS holders and support for humanitarian protections, even as concerns about border security and immigration enforcement remained strong. Analysts noted that the personal narrative circulating in the media had softened some attitudes, illustrating how exposure to individual experiences can influence broader policy views. The case had transformed TPS from an obscure bureaucratic designation into a widely discussed issue, bringing it into living rooms and dinner table conversations across the country. For Kristi Noem, the political consequences continued to unfold in real time as supporters rallied behind her defiance, while critics highlighted the court's harsh critique as evidence of reckless leadership. Her public appearances became more carefully scripted, with fewer off-the-cuff remarks and greater emphasis on legal arguments, suggesting a strategic recalibration in response to the ruling's fallout. Yet the earlier rhetoric remained etched into the public record, frequently resurfacing in news segments and online discussions as a reminder of how quickly political bravado can collide with judicial reality.